Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Pathways to Promise Special Edition webinar on creating a rule of life. My name is Jermaine Alberti, and I'm the Executive Director of Pathways to Promise. And I have with me two friends, Robin Sandbothe and Ircel Harrison with Pinnacle Leadership Associates, who are going to share with us their resource, Creating a Rule of Life. I asked Robin and Ircel to introduce themselves as far as giving a bio, because they best know what we should know about them before they start sharing with us this wonderful resource. We're going to have a couple of polls today, some breakout rooms. We're going to try to make this a very interactive experience with you. We do want to invite you to use your reactions at the bottom of your tool. So if you want to clap, use the clap hands. You can also do a thumbs up. Also, if you happen to have any questions, please use the chat feature, and I'll be tracking those questions for us to ask in our Q&A period. So without any further delay, I want to introduce to you once again, Robin and Ircel.
Robin, go first.
Okay, I had down you were going to go first, so I was patiently waiting. I'm Robin Sandbothe. I am one of the newest associates for Pinnacle Leadership Associates. I'm also a co-pastor of Inglewood Baptist Church in Gladstone, Missouri, which is one of the suburbs of Kansas City. I also serve as Director of Seminary Relations for Central Baptist Theological Seminary, which is in Shawnee, Kansas, also in the metro area of Kansas City. And I've been there for some time, been at the church for a few years as well, and new at Pinnacle. So that's probably all you need to know about me right now.
Thanks, Robin. Ircel Harrison, I'm the coaching coordinator for Pinnacle Leadership Associates and also a supplemental professor for Central Seminary in Shawnee. Pinnacle is a group of folks who provide coaching and consulting for churches, and we're happy to have Robin on board, especially in the area of spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices. Let me share my screen. Okay, if you can see that, give me a thumbs up, either by your, yeah, great, okay, we're good. I approached Robin a while back about writing a resource for churches, specifically relating to creating a rule of life. One of the things we do in Pinnacle Leadership Associates is we work with churches to face some of the challenges of the 21st century. And one of these is moving from a member mentality to a disciple mentality, being more intentional in our church participation and our own personal spiritual growth. And we've talked a lot about the use of a rule of life and what this might mean to help people engage more fully in the life of the community. So because of Robin's background in this area, she came on board, and together we prepared this resource, which we rolled out in the spring. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that and introduce some of the basic concepts and ideas related to creating a rule of life. So here are the objectives we're going to try to achieve today. First of all, explaining exactly what a rule of life is, and talk a little bit about the place of a rule of life in the history of the church. Reflect on the importance of a rule of life for today, not only for the church, but for other gatherings. People want an intentional walk, something that leads to their own personal development. And we see ways that the rule of life can contribute to this, not only in a religious setting or a faith-based community, but in other ways as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you might consider planning to create a rule of life with your own faith community or with your own particular group. And Robin?
We thought we would start the session with a time of reflection. And this is a practice that you might easily incorporate into your rule of life. But you might use scripture. I've chosen to use a poem today as the basis for our time of reflection. I'm going to ask you to find a relaxed, alert position. And it helps to have both of your feet on the floor and your neck and spine aligned. And if you want to close your eyes, you can do that. So I want us first to start focusing on our breathing. So notice your breath. Notice your thoughts. Begin breathing from your diaphragm. And hold your breath briefly, and then release it slowly. You release it about twice as long as you breathed in. And then pause at the bottom with a very still mind. So continue this breathing in, releasing it slowly, breathing in, releasing it slowly. Continue, and as you breathe in all that is of God. Breathe out all in your body and mind that is not. Breathe in peace. Breathe out all the clutter and distractions. Now listen to this poem by Mary Oliver entitled Yes, No. How necessary it is to have opinions. I think the spotted trout lilies are satisfied, standing a few inches above the earth. I think serenity is not something you just find in the world like a palm tree holding up its white petals. The violets along the river are opening their blue faces like small, dark lanterns. The green mosses, being so many, are as good as brawny. How important it is to walk along, not in haste, but slowly, looking at everything and calling out, yes, no. The swan, for all his pomp, his robes of glass and petals, wants only to be allowed to live on the nameless pond. The catbrier is without fault. The water thrushes down among the sloppy rocks are going crazy with happiness. Imagination is better than a sharp instrument. To pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. Now I'm going to read the poem once more. And I want you to notice where your attention is drawn. Listen for God's voice or for your inner voice. Hear the word or the thought that you need to hear for today. How necessary it is to have opinions. I think the spotted trout lilies are satisfied, standing a few inches above the earth. I think serenity is not something you just find in the world like a plum tree holding up its white petals. The violets along the river are opening their blue faces like small, dark lanterns. The green mosses, being so many, are as good as brawny. How important it is to walk along, not in haste, but slowly, looking at everything and calling out, yes, no. The swan, for all his pomp, his robes of glass and petals, wants only to be allowed to live on the nameless pond. The catbrier is without fault. The water thrushes down among the sloppy rocks are going crazy with happiness. Imagination is better than a sharp instrument. To pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. As you continue to listen, let the word or words, the thought resonate within you. What is God saying to you? Where is God leading you? To what are you being called to pay attention? Where is your inner voice taking you? Sit quietly. Rest in God's presence. While you are still focused on what you've heard or sensed that God is saying to you, open your eyes if you haven't already, and write down or type a word or phrase that captures what it is you think God was telling you, what you thought you were hearing, so that you can return to it later. Now, I'd like to ask, would any of you like to share your word or phrase?
I was taken by that word or that phrase, the sharp edge of imagination, because everything in this draws you to imagine the setting. And as you imagine the setting, it's a very peaceful setting. It's just here again, paying attention to what's going on, and reminds me I don't pay attention to many things on a day-by-day basis that are significant.
Good.
Just the process of stopping and reflecting for a few moments, to me, was, I think, one of the most powerful things, reminding me that I don't stop enough just to reflect. We're just really busy people. And so the rule of life is just stopping to reflect. That's a good rule to adopt. I see Robert Myers said the swan was one of the words that stood out to her.
Yeah. It's a vivid image, isn't it? Yeah. Anyone else like to share one? I don't want to stop this if you want to. Well, I would encourage you to return to your word or phrase to reflect on what you were hearing or sensing in the days ahead, and perhaps to spend a longer time with them, simply listening after practicing a similar breathing exercise in stillness and quiet. Let God guide you. Trust God's voice. Trust yourself to listen for God's voice. Trust that inner voice that tells you what you need to hear. Thank you. Ircel?
Thank you, Robin. I know this is a very diverse group of people, and we're going to take a poll so you can identify what particular group you most particularly identify with. And here are some possibilities. Jermaine will bring up the poll in just a minute, but are you a congregational leader working with a faith community? Are you a leader in a mental health organization? Perhaps you're an institutional chaplain, or a sole practitioner, a therapist, a coach, a counselor, etc. Or you may be the leader of a judicatory, a denominational group of some type. Or you may feel like you don't fit into any of these particular categories. But Jermaine's going to bring up the poll and give you an opportunity to respond to the one that most closely identifies your particular vocation and role and your level of involvement.
We're still waiting to hear from 4 other persons. Once again, if your role is not there, just choose other. I'll give us a few more seconds here. All right, so I'm sharing our results, so you should see those on your screen.
So we have a large number, 50% congregational leaders involved, and then about 33% are leaders in mental health organizations, 17% you're a sole practitioner of some kind, and the other 33% would be in the other category. So it's great to see the diversity of folks who are involved here, and very helpful to, let me go back. Very helpful to see the different interests that come to this. And as we talk about this, although we originally designed this around faith communities, we also recognized as we were developing this resource that there is a desire in any type of community to develop some ways of encouraging each other in growth and in relationship. And so we hope you'll think about how this particularly applies to your particular situation as we go forward. Robin?
Yeah, so what exactly is a rule of life? Maybe we can get rid of the poll. There we go. So you see on the screen, Marjorie Thompson. I don't know if you know Marjorie Thompson. She wrote Soul Feast, and it's a book of different kinds of practices. And she defines the rule of life as a pattern of spiritual disciplines that provide structure and direction for growth and holiness. It fosters gifts of the Spirit in personal life and human community, helping to form us into the person God intends us to be. And I would go on to say that a rule of life is like a trellis that supports a plant, a framework around which a person or a community organizes everything they do. For me, it's a set of practices I use that strengthen my faith journey. Practices like centering prayer, walking a labyrinth, meeting regularly with a spiritual director, worshiping with other believers. Those practices are the framework for my faith to grow or to strengthen my relationship with God. Now, for a community, it is the practices they follow that help them live out their mission. For a congregation, it's the way they do church, the practices that help them live out the mission God has called them to. Things like worshiping together, practicing discernment, maybe feeding the hungry or caring for the earth. So, Ircel, let's talk about what's the history of a rule of life.
As you can imagine, no matter what faith tradition you look at, there is some element of this developing a way that people might live together and honor their commitments. But in the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, let me share some ideas related to, first of all, to Scripture. And in the Hebrew Bible, perhaps the apex of ethical understanding is found in Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Now, as you look at that text, that not only speaks to an ethical concern, but it really is a guiding rule for us to practice as individuals and as part of a community of faith. It challenges us to be more and to think about not only how we relate to God, but how we relate to others in our particular area of life, the people that we come in contact with on a daily basis. In the New Testament, we could find a number of examples. One that I've pulled out for the resource was the Beatitudes, Jesus teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And if we look at the Beatitudes, it really, if we think about what that says to an individual follower of Christ, it's a clear pattern of action. It's a clear way of being and doing as we relate to others, and builds us into becoming more committed followers or disciples of Jesus Christ. This carried over into the early church. And about 2nd century, there was a writing called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12, which circulated among the churches of that time, that gave basic guidance on how to live life as individuals and as a community. It became a guide for faith and for practice, and it is very practical. It gives specific instructions and ideas about how to relate to each other within the community, how to relate to those who come into the community, and to those who are passers-by, so to speak. But early on, the church started to see not only do we need the writings we have received from the Hebrew Bible and from early Christian leaders, but there are other ways that we can develop a structure, a trellis, to help us as we grow. And then later still, the first real communities developed around the desert mystics, those who went apart from society to have a closer relationship with God. But they also struggled with how to relate to each other in a significant way. And this really issued over into the monastic tradition. Most of us have heard of St. Benedict, and early in the 5th century, he began, or late in the 5th century, he began to develop a rule of life, the rule of St. Benedict, as it's come to be called, that would guide a group of people as they came together to deepen their own relationship with God. And the real idea behind the rule of St. Benedict is not to give power and authority to a leader like an abbot within a monastery or within a group, but to define the relationships of the monks to each other, how they treated each other, how they supported and encouraged each other as they attempted to become closer to God. So this is this is something that's very, I think, innate in who we are as people, striving to be more than we are right now. And we find in the Judeo-Christian tradition a good bit of information and guidance about how people can learn together, work together, and deepen their own relationship to God and to what's significant in their lives.
So I think what you just said, Ircel, tells us why a rule of life is important for today. Those things are still true. And I would add that intentionality is the key. A rule helps us pay attention. And in the midst of all the chaos that's happening today, a rule helps us pay attention to the important stuff, the stuff that gives our lives meaning. I mean, there are so many distractions. We're worried about getting the virus. We're worried about getting our work done that we need to get done when we're working from home. We're worrying about when things will feel normal again. And a rule helps keep us on track. It helps us to declutter. A rule helps us to live with intentionality, with purpose. A rule helps us claim our identity and stay true to it. And it's not as if we can't grow spiritually without it, but a rule provides the framework, that trellis I talked about earlier. A rule helps us keep on track, and a rule provides accountability, and we all need that. And as with the rule of St. Benedict that Ircel mentioned, and that is one of the most well-known rules, a rule helps a community to be formed together. When creating a rule, it helps a congregation or a community to identify their values. And then following the rule keeps those values always before them. Following a rule, a congregation or other community as formed together helps the community claim its identity, become who God has called them to be. So there are some examples of intentional communities today that aren't necessarily religious. The Burning Man, some of you may have heard of that group. It started with a small group on a beach burning the effigy of a man, and has grown into a huge community with a city that rises out of the desert once a year, and another effigy is burned. But this community now has a set of principles that one could call a rule of life, which those who count themselves among the Burning Man community agree to follow. Or there's the new monastic movement. You may have heard of Shane Claiborne, his community. There are certain things that they agree together to do. Or Ircel, bring up that next slide. The Jerusalem Farm, which for me is right here in Kansas City. It's a Catholic intentional community. And it's built on these four cornerstones: prayer, community, service, and simplicity. And as you can see, they have these listed as their ways that they do community. So that's all about relationship for them. And I think that is key for this. So if we think about what's happening right now with the coronavirus and the restrictions that have accompanied it, how would your congregation or your community, having identified its rule of life, have helped you to continue to be the community or the church you are meant to or want to be? You could answer those if you want to. If you'd had a rule of life, how do you think it might have helped? You can chat your answers, or if you want to say them aloud, we can allow some space for that right now. Maybe too soon to ask that question. So I'm going to go ahead and I want you to think about, what are the things that are holding your community together? If you can identify these things, you're beginning to identify your church's rule of life. The ways you practice faith together as community may have changed, but the underlying principles for those practices have not. The ways you meet together, the ways you accomplish your mission have likely changed, but your underlying purpose has not. So the next slide, Ircel, how do we develop a rule of life? First, developing a rule of life is not something that happens overnight. It takes time and intentionality. It takes a person or a group to lead the process. It takes commitment as well. It's sort of like the difference between following a fad diet and making a lifestyle change in your eating habits. And there are certain characteristics that are part of the process. So Ircel, bring those up. So you see the list there: spiritual preparation and discernment. That characteristic has to do with listening, sitting with yourself, with your organization, with God, and listening to who you are, who your organization is, who God wants you or your community to be. Another characteristic is that it's contextual. Your rule of life needs to fit who you are, who your community is. It isn't one size fits all. You can look at other models like the ones I just talked about to get an idea of what a rule of life might look like, but ultimately it has to fit who you are and what your purpose is. Then it's growth oriented. It's growth oriented versus survival oriented. A rule of life isn't about how to save your organization from failing. It's not about projecting a budget and where you're going to be in 5 or 10 years from now. It is about who you want to be as a community. And then finally, becoming a disciple or living intentionally. A rule of life helps form us as a community. It unites us around our purpose and identity. It helps us live intentionally, aware of who we are and whose we are. Helps us pay attention to what's important. Helps us let go of serving out of a sense of obligation. It's about living into God's grace and God's love. So now the next slide, Ircel. Let's talk a little about your process of creating a rule of life. So around spiritual preparation and discernment, how would you begin? Spiritual preparation and discernment are the starting point for this process. This aspect of the process could start with your pastor or your leadership team or your church board or your council or your cabinet. It could begin with a small group who desire to grow closer to God, who want to learn more about discernment. You could do a whole church study or focus on discernment, or could invite your constituents to join you in a discernment process. There are lots of good resources out there. The Way of Discernment would be one, Companions in Christ series by Stephen Dowdy and Marjorie Thompson. Listening Hearts, Discerning Call and Community by Farnham, Gill, McLean, and Ward. Listen for God's Leading, a workbook for corporate spiritual discernment by Val Eisenhower and Judith Todd. Or if you're familiar with Parker Palmer, he has a great book, Let Your Life Speak. Or if you're more into the meditation side of things, The Miracle of Mindfulness, a manual on meditation by Thich Nhat Hanh might be a good place to start. Or a resource by Margaret Gunther, At Home in the World, a rule of life for the rest of us. The second thing might be, what is your community's unique vision? What are you passionate about? What does your context, your community's giftedness, compel you to do to further God's reign in the world, to accomplish your purpose for which your organization was created? So then you use what you learned about discernment, and the next step is using that discernment process to determine what your community's values are, what God is calling you to do. As you're listening, to be more intentional and paying attention, what are you finding out about yourself, your community, and what you truly want to give yourselves to? Looking at other models can help. What have other communities done? Are there elements of their rule that would work for your community? And what practices are you already doing? What are things that are important to your community already? But then also, what new practices would stretch you or help you to grow spiritually? The third step, how will you know your community is moving closer to God? How will you know you're moving closer to fulfilling your unique mission in the world? Now, this process doesn't use the kind of benchmarks that come with planning a budget or a business plan. So how will you know your rule of life is working for your community? One thing I think you'll discover is that you will have a better idea of who you are. You'll feel more like everyone is on the same page. Not that you'll always agree with one another, but you will always know you are working towards the same end. You will find your relationships are stronger, that you care more about each other and the gifts that each of you bring to your organization. Now, you'll need to remember to allow some flexibility as you identify the practices you want to incorporate into your rule. It'll likely become clear what works and what doesn't in your context, and it's okay to let some things go. Think of it like, compost. It's something that you're using to discover what's next. It's the soil that allows things to grow. So make space. Make space in your worship to listen for God's voice, or cultivate silence in your leadership team and board meetings. Finally then, live into your rule. Continue to listen for God's voice. Practice grace along with cultivating discipline. They're called practices for a reason. You practice them. And remember always that God's love encompasses all. So Ircel, I think we're ready for some breakout groups.
Yeah, we're going to give you about 10 minutes to discuss this among yourselves. Jermaine will facilitate the breakout groups, but here are the 3 questions we'd like for you to think about in your particular group. First of all, what questions do you have about creating and practicing a rule of life? Robin's gone over this very quickly and given us some ideas, but what are some questions that come out of your own experience and of your particular context? Second thing to think about, what's the benefit of this? How would practicing a rule of life benefit your church or group or organization? What would be some positive outcomes that would motivate you to want to engage in this? And then what's the first step you take? How do you get started? What's the first step down this road? So 3 questions. What questions have come out of this discussion so far about creating and practicing a rule of life? What would be a benefit of practicing a rule of life in your particular group? And then what's your first step? And we're going to take about 10 minutes for this, and then we'll come back. And I hope that out of your group, you'll generate 2 or 3 questions that you might want to share with a larger group.
So while you're in your breakout rooms, I would ask that one of you all serve as a recorder to write down what the response is to these questions here. And then one of you all choose to be a reporter. So someone choose to be a recorder, writing down your responses to these questions. And then someone choose to be once again, recorder, writing down. So 2 roles, recorder and reporter. I will do my best to try to get these questions into your breakout rooms also, so you can see them again. So I will break you all out randomly into breakout rooms here. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to have a good discussion in your breakout rooms. It never fails. You're right in the thick of good discussion and somebody says, it's time to end it. So sorry that happened to you. I know what adult learners, so you give them 10 minutes, they spend 4 minutes talking about everything else and then get into the work. So I know that happens many times. So I asked for each room to choose a representative to be the spokesperson for that particular room. We had 2 breakout rooms. So I would love for one of you all to agree to be that spokesperson and share what your group came up with those 3 questions. So which breakout room wants to go first? Breakout room 1 or 2?
I think I was in breakout
2, we can go.
Oh, Sue, that's you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll have Sue, we'll talk breakout room 2. And Barbara, were you number 1?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we'll go in that order then.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is Sue Ann, and I am a faith community nurse here in Denver, Colorado. And I had 3 wonderful people in my group. Mark's in San Antonio. I don't know exactly where Rick and Doug are, but we're all pretty focused on the rule of life individually and thinking of how that would fit within our community, our faith community, or the community that we work in. Doug works with a lot of different churches around mental health ministries, as Mark is a mental health project lead. Rick is he's part of a congregation, but he's looking for his own personal rule of life. And I, as a faith community nurse, my goal is to have our faith community be a safe place where it's okay to talk about mental health and mental illness. And we all agreed that a key part of beginning a rule of life for ourselves or for the community we're a part of is intentionality. That's a key word. It takes intention. It's not going to just happen. And by us role modeling it for ourselves and using the language around a rule of life and the intention of it and the purpose of it would be very key in helping to have it be practiced in our own lives and in our communities. And the questions we had, one of the questions was how to prepare yourself and then your community for this, because there are a lot of different models out there. But I think personally, for me, what helps me is just to take the time to be still as the wonderful reflection that we started with at the beginning. I really appreciated that. Let's see, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Robin did with us. I think that to be intentional in that regard, to be able to listen and have our questions answered, and to seek the guidance that God can give us. But if we're always distracted and always busy, we will never hear those answers and that guidance. Now, Mark or Doug or Rick, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Suzanne, I think you did a great job.
Doug Beach is the vice president of the board of Pathways to Promise, as well as president of the board of NAMI San Antonio. And so as we at Pathways to Promise think about ways we can help faith communities address mental health and culture and faith, I thought this would be a great webinar for us to think about how do we put this into practice through rules, to ways to guide us. So I'm grateful to hear the feedback from your group, Sue, and Robert. I'm excited to hear from your group. What was your, what did you all come up with?
Well, we also realized that there is a lot of intentionality of, you know, doing something on purpose because you want to do it rather than just letting things happen. And I guess one of the questions was, does a person have their own rule of life, or does the group have their own rule of life, right? Or is it both? And how do they complement each other, or maybe go against each other sometimes, you know, depending on the situation. Mine was a question about whether this was a Christian context, or whether it also applied to other faith, interfaith, you know, like Muslims, Buddhists, things like that. And as far as what benefits we saw, we saw that it allows us to be more focused and more, you know, having people in an organization stay on the same page with each other, you know, gives sort of direction and help determine the parameters about how you will work together in your organization. And the first step is, we said, is sort of what you were saying. The first step is reading and contemplation about, you know, your own purpose. And then also, if we're in an organization, we want to do this for an organization, well, how do we convince the management of the organization and folks that, you know, that is what we want to do, and the governing board that we want to do? Because if you want to do something that really reflects the whole organization, you have to have everybody, you know, agreed to participate in it. And so, you know, getting the folks together, you know, letting them assess the needs of the community and focus on that. So, and I know Jessica took some notes. Is there anything I left out, Jessica?
I think you really covered it all well, Barbara.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So the lift from that, I heard that, are there individual rule of lives? Are there group rules of life? Do they sometimes come in conflict with one another? And I'll let Robin and Ircel address that. The other thing I heard, though, is the application of this across different faith or spiritual communities. And can this be something that's not just a Christian practice, but one across? And I can say most definitely, with intentionality, it would be Pathways go, that this be something we go across denominations, faith traditions, spiritual traditions. So I'll let Ircel and Robin address what they've heard from both groups, and then we'll continue with the presentation. And we started this at 10:30, and it is now 11:34. We set aside about an hour and a half for this webinar. So we only have a few more things left in the webinar, but just hang out with us. I think we're having a great discussion. And Robin and Ircel, I'll turn it back to you.
Robin, why don't you address that first question about individual and group?
Yeah, I think, sure, there could be some conflicts, but I have a feeling that if a person has their own rule of life and they're part of a community, the whole goal of the rule of life for a community is to bring the community together. So I feel like they would find some commonalities. There would be points at which they would connect. But I don't think they all have to be the same. I think an individual's rule is going to apply to their own life, and it wouldn't necessarily apply to the whole group. But there will probably be some overlap, is what I would guess.
And an additional observation there would be that that really the best way for us to grow is to grow in groups of accountability, or being part of a group that provides accountability for us. So I think that's really kind of the history of this approach to growth, is that we enter into relationship with others who have similar or mutual commitments, and we build on that.
Yeah, I agree. I really liked how the first group focused in on listening. I think that's key. I think that's key to discernment, that if you try to discern without listening, it doesn't work very well. So I would say that's a really good place to start. And that has overlap to the last question, or one of the last group's questions, about how do you get your whole organization to get involved when it's just a small group of you who are thinking about how important a rule of life might be for that organization. And so I would say another key of listening is for that, or that listening is another key for that. And I also think if you start with a small group, and this works even with the church, a small group decides we really want to focus on discernment. We want to know what God is leading us towards. Or we really want to think about how, as an organization, if we could be cohesive and be more community, that we could do our job so much better, or we could achieve our end purpose so much better. Even if you just have a small group that you start this with, it could have a tendency to go beyond the bounds of that group. And I think that you will have more influence than you realize. You can't guarantee it, of course, but if the organization can see the kind of community that you're building with what you're doing, even if you do a rule of life just for that small community, say it's one segment of the organization, and they can see how it works, it may have an influence on the whole organization's ideas.
And to build off that, Robin, I believe in the experiment approach. You don't necessarily have to get an entire organization involved to launch an experiment. And so if you have a team within an organization that wants to do something like this, that's a good beginning point for practicing that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me talk about kind of is this exclusively a Christian practice? And it's not. I think we could look at, from the faith standpoint, we could look at practically any major religion or significant religion. There are intentional communities within each of those, whether it's Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever. And they're built around the idea of deepening one's practice in that particular faith. It also applies, I think, in other areas as well. One of the things that I did not mention at the beginning was that not everybody likes the term rule of life. They may refer to what they're doing as practicing core habits, or this may be group practices or faith practices, something like that. I have a friend who is pastor of a church in Florida, and they're developing a rule of life for their congregation. And somebody's pushed back on that idea of rule. so they're coming up with different language for that. But the idea is, especially as a group, that we agree together. That's part of building the accountability within the group. We talk about what we need and how can we help each other, and what are the mutual commitments we can make in order to further our growth as individuals within this account.
Lost your sound.
So it is ultimately, it helps us to grow as individuals, but what makes it work most effectively is we have committed to others to help them to fulfill their own goals, and we work together in that. How does this work in a secular setting? I think here again in the Creating a Rule of Life resource, we've included a couple of more secular examples of this that you might look at. And here again, this is a great opportunity to be creative and come up with how do we identify these things in such a way that they are important to us and carry the impact that we want it to carry, without being prejudicial or pejorative in some way, and indicate that this is a growth process that we're involved in.
And there's a lot of grace involved in it.
Yeah. What do we not address that we need to address from these two groups? Sue Ann or Barbara, have we covered what we need to talk about here? Or do you have other questions that came out of your group that we haven't answered or addressed?
No, this is Sue Ann. I think you did a great job of addressing them. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, so we didn't have our full time to discuss. We were kind of just getting going with it. But we appreciate the time together, and we thank you for this. I do agree that I think being intentional and starting with ourselves first is really an important way to model and to learn for ourselves first, and then show that to our group. I'm hoping to do that with my health ministry team, which is a small group within my congregation. And my congregation actually did have a strategic plan unveiled recently, where they're focusing on 3 words: worship, grow, and go. And so I think fitting a rule of life, maybe not even calling it that, but I think that absolutely can fit into that framework. And then my hope is to begin with my small health ministry team and help them to be intentional about their own personal rule of life and discernment and listening and knowing what God is calling us to do as a group in our congregation, which I hope to focus on mental health and mental illness issues in our congregation. So yeah, thank you. I think that's good. And if my group wants to add anything, Mark, Rick, or Doug, go for it.
Don't hear anything. Barbara, anything else that we need to address out of your group?
No, I think it's becoming more clear. I especially like what Sue Ann said about, doing something intentionally within a small group that's focused on mental health issues, where the rule that you're working on is focused on mental health. It doesn't have to be the entire organization's purpose, but you can have something that's more, focused on something and doesn't have to, encompass the entire organization in order to be an effective rule.
And that was really one of my goals in organizing this webinar, is that sometimes a faith community may say, we want to focus on mental health, we want to focus on disabilities, we want to focus on a specific area. In that particular group size, that's their focus. So what are the practices that we will, or rules we will develop to help us do that work? And so I thought this could be a good process to walk through that in groups. So it doesn't have to be a whole congregation, a whole organization. It could be clusters who come together with a particular rule of life or a practice of life.
And you know, in a mental health setting, one of the things you might want to deal with is how are we working together to be mentally healthy as individuals? You know, how do we model the practices that we hope to make a part of our particular organization or our vocation? And if we're not practicing these and not holding each other accountable, then who will?
I like that. This is Mark Carmona in San Antonio. Our cohort of churches is really trying to use the language of mental wellness because there is stigma that's attached to it. But I think we found using the term wellness also allows us to have more space to work inside congregations.
Yeah, Mark, we are embracing the ideal of wellness also at Pathways as a holistic approach to caring for the whole person. And so wellness, I think we are most definitely still trying to do it with the stigma around mental health, mental well-being, trying to deal with that. But most definitely, I think when we talk about wellness as a whole, then folks are more willing to open up and have those discussions about wellness as the whole being versus segmented. But yeah.
Agreed.
Great discussion. Great discussion. I wish we could have had that as a whole main group now, but hey, it was rich to have it individually. So, Robin and Ircel, I'll let y'all wrap up with the remaining parts of the presentation you have, and then we have one more poll. We'll do a little Q&A. We have about 14 minutes left. So,
okay. And let me just, and Robin, you may have a comment or two, but I would say that I think especially as a result of the COVID-19, the pandemic situation we find ourselves in, if anything, issues of mental wellness have been heightened and more of a challenge for us perhaps than ever before. And I'm particularly, in the work that I do, I'm particularly concerned about this from the standpoint of caregivers, whether these be health caregivers, mental health caregivers, or counselors. I think that this is a time that stretched all of these people to the maximum. And I certainly encourage whatever you can do to help people to deal with this in a healthy way and to thrive in the future. Robin, you want to make any other comment before I go to next steps?
Well, I was going to say, in the light of COVID-19, you probably couldn't do this right now, but if you wanted to experience what it's like to be a part of a community that has a rule, the Benedictine communities, and they're all over the place, you could probably find one pretty close to where you live. One of their parts of their rule is hospitality, and they almost always have, I think they always have, a guest house, and they welcome visitors. They welcome people being part of their community for even, like a weekend or an overnight, and you can be a part of their prayer times and kind of see how their community works. And it'd be a great way to introduce a small group to what a rule of life is like.
Let me move to kind of an application step here, and you may have generated some ideas about how you want to work this in your particular setting. And here again, as we've indicated several times, this is very contextual. But from the standpoint of what Robin and I offer, let me just share some possibilities for you that are available to you through Pinnacle Leadership Associates. One would be the possibility of a free 1-hour consulting session on creating a rule of life. And we'd be glad to schedule that with you. At the end, I'm going to bring up our email addresses so that you might contact us if you're interested in this kind of service. But this will be an opportunity just to further the discussion of what we've talked about here and talk about how this might work in your particular setting. A second thing would be a 90-minute webinar similar to this one to introduce creating a rule of life to your church or organization. And in doing that, this would certainly be adapted to your particular setting and some of the concerns that are intentions that you have for pursuing this approach. Second possibility would be coaching for you. If you wanted to do 6 months of coaching as you are leading your team to develop and live into a rule of life. She would be willing to enter into a contract for a period of time to offer that service to you. And then, of course, individual coaching. If you personally want to deepen your own spiritual walk or your own intentionality, Robin would be available to be a coach in that particular setting. So just to think about possibilities, and we're not asking you to sign up here at this point, but we're going to launch a poll and just see if what kind of interest you might have in each of these particular steps. Free 1-hour consulting session, a 90-minute webinar, similar to what we've done here, a 6-month coaching contract as you provide leadership for your team to move in this direction, or individual coaching for your own particular spiritual development. So, Jermaine, you want to launch that poll?
We're going to try to do that here in a moment.
Okay.
Okay. Like the poll has been disabled because we have a couple of folks logged in the same location, so it disables the poll there. So what I would love for you all to do is that I'm going to have Ircel put up the email address for.
Sorry to interrupt. I think I just relaunched the poll.
Okay.
No, that's the first one.
Okay. Try the other one. There should be 2 there.
I only see the one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
No worries. We will send an email to those of you who are on this call.
There we go.
Did you got it?
I got it.
Okay. Let's launch the poll then. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
In the world of technology. Did you launch it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Hopefully those persons who see it will complete it. And then once you've done that, then we will launch the results, hopefully.
Technological thing is always interesting. And I'll share that I was on a Zoom call with folks from the Zoom organization a couple of months ago when they were explaining how to do certain things, and they had trouble as well. So,
so when the creators have problems, we know we're in good company then.
That's right.
Yeah. So the poll was launched, I'm assuming, and hopefully we can get the results shared.
So far, only 1 of 2 of 8 people have voted.
Okay. Once again, please understand that this is not committing you to any of these 4 things. It's just a way for us to gauge what interest there may be for those of you who've gathered. So please know that you're not committing to any of these things, just letting us know what interest you might have. Once again, Ircel is going to put out the email address for Robin and himself, and would love for you to document that so that you can send them an email individually and let them know if you are interested in moving forward. Also, there is a website to learn more about Pinnacle Leadership at pinlead.com. Also, you'll be able to find this webinar at Pathways to Promise website at pathway2promise.org. So we will encourage you to share this webinar with others who's not able to be in attendance. So once again, that poll was simply for us to gauge what interest there might be in those 4 different offerings. Any more results there, Jessica?
Yep, we have 4 folks who have voted, all of whom are interested in the 1-hour consulting session.
Perfect. So those folks, those 4 folks who said that there was interest there, please reach out to Robin or Ircel. Let them know that you attended this webinar and that you are interested, and they will follow up with you from there. I'm going to give Robin and Ircel an opportunity for closing remarks, and I'll make some, and then we'll wrap up our time together. So Robin, Ircel.
I'll go first, I guess. I really appreciate all of you being a part of this today, and hope that this has been a helpful conversation, and that you'll consider at least thinking about having a process, either with your congregation or your group of congregations or your community that you're a part of, or with yourself. Start thinking about, how could I have a rule of life for my own life? Ircel?
Yeah, I want to thank you for your participation today. I think it speaks well of your commitment for your own personal development, as well as furthering the health of your organization, whatever it may happen to be. And this is a time, I think, that really calls upon us to form good, strong partnerships with one another in order to accomplish the challenges, to overcome the challenges that we're facing today. So thank you for your participation and for your good questions.
It's not. Oh my God, should complain the whole way.
No, I want you to thank.
Get behind the exhaust of this.
If you can mute your microphone, if that's you in the background, I want to thank you all for joining us on today for this special edition webinar. We bi-monthly typically have what is called the Engage, Learn, and Network Leadership Forum, where we have a guest speaker come and speak, as well as use it as an opportunity for us to share what we're doing in our individual organizations. So we will send you an email and invite you to be part of that leadership forum if you're not part of it already. Our goal is, we know that we are most definitely stronger together as organizations. And so where we can complement one another, we want to do so. And so I'm grateful that you took time out of your day to be with us on this morning, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again on another webinar or leadership forum. I want to thank Robin and Ircel again for your time, for doing this for us. And we will most definitely welcome you to come back and share other work that you're doing with Pinnacle Leadership Associates. So with that being said, thank you so much. We'll have this posted in the next 24 to 48 hours on our website, and we'll see you a link. Have a great day.
Thank you,
so much.
Jermaine.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.